Okay, here is part 2 of the History of Psychology video lecture for my Upward Bound students at West Virginia State. This should be the last slide that you saw in the first video. Again, random cute pet pictures have nothing to do with this lecture. Just a nice way to kind of distract you for a minute. Now back to the real stuff. We're leaving the world of ancient Greece. There are a million people that I could talk to you about who have influenced somehow and in some way psychology. I'm trying to be careful to select the big ones, the giants, if you will, so I don't really bore you and bog you down with history stuff. But nevertheless, we're going to move to a guy by the name of René Descartes. He was a British mathematician and philosopher. So we're moving ahead in history quite a bit here, getting a bit past the Dark Ages into the Renaissance. 1596 to 1650 is when Descartes lived. Now, you may not have heard of Descartes, but you've probably heard his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." That was him. Now, there was this really boring debate going on at the time about whether the mind and the body were one thing or two different things. If you were a monist, M-O-N-I-S-T, that meant that you believed that mind and body were the same thing. But then there were people who were dualists, and you see that in quotations. He was a dualist. Descartes thought that the mind and the body were completely separate, and that the mind could affect the body, and conversely the body could affect the mind. Interesting. It may sound a little boring to you, but it's kind of an interesting debate. And if you think about it, I think it is fair to assert that your mind can affect your body. Think about it. If your mind is in a position where you're upset, you're thinking about something negative, and you dwell on it and you dwell on it, it can affect your appetite, how you eat. It can affect your sleep, which in turn will affect your body. Your body can affect your mind as well. I've talked to many clients who are unhappy with their bodies. They think they're overweight, they think they're unattractive, and it affects the way that they think. It affects their minds. It affects the way they think about the world. They think people don't like them. They think they will not be successful because their bodies are not perfect. So I would happen to agree with Descartes. Now, his important contribution for psychology, and make sure this is in your notes somewhere, he believed in empiricism. This is very important for science, but also for psychology, as it is a science as well. Empiricism is a philosophy stressing that the only way of obtaining knowledge is through the senses. Now, we already talked a little bit about the importance of acquiring information through the senses, but empiricism also involves a standardized and systematic way of measuring something. That's science. So he was the first person to stress that the obtaining of knowledge needs to be, if we're going to study that, it needs to be sort of scientific. And the way that you do that is through the senses. And psychology has definitely borrowed that idea. You've probably heard of Charles Darwin, British scientist, Voyage of the Beagle, Survival of the Fittest, lived from 1809 to 1882. And again, you may be thinking, what does this have to do with psychology? Well, he was a scientist, and he was a natural scientist. But his ideas were very quickly applied to the human world, or human population. I'm not going to give you a lecture on the Voyage of the Beagle, but he basically was working with plants. He was working with non-human factors, if you will. And he found that, basically organisms would pass on their strongest traits, which would ensure or maximize their chances for survival. And that was based on, adapting to the physical environment. Organisms, you would pass on the most favorable characteristics to ensure survival based on temperature, based on climate, based on, dangers around. And that's sort of how things worked. And survival of the fittest. The most fit organisms in their environment would survive, and the weakest ones would die off. Very simple. Bigger animals eat smaller animals. If you're not equipped to deal with cold weather, then you're going to die. So that's just kind of how it worked. And that's fine, but then people started applying these ideas to people. Herbert Spencer was a British philosopher, lived from 1820 to 1903. So he came along and said, well, if this stuff works with plants and animals, it works with people too, right? So the idea of natural selection. He came up, and others like him came up with this idea that it works the same way with people. People pass on their most favorable characteristics, the ones that will maximize their chances of survival, to their offspring, and so forth and so forth. And those that are not fit to survive will simply die off. So we're starting to see, this is during a time, not to turn this into history or sociology, but during the 1800s and 1900s, we're talking about a time where overpopulation, human overpopulation with humans, is a real problem. We have explosion with population growth in some parts of the world, especially in the United States and Europe. And people start to wonder and worry, oh my gosh, we have all these people, but we don't have any more land space. What's going to happen? People are going to starve to death because there's going to be more people than resources. So people like Spencer are coming along and saying, let's don't help the poor and the needy, because they're at the bottom of the food chain anyway. They're the weakest links. If we feed them, if we give them money, if we help them, they're just going to survive on longer, and they're going to pull the rest of us down. So why not let the weakest die off? Now that's a pretty troubling philosophy when you apply it to human beings. And you start to see how this could sound a little bit like some other bad things that were about to happen in Nazi Germany. Hitler got a lot of his ideas from these philosophies, by the way. So now we start to see how this is applied to the human population. And some of the earliest psychologists were coming along and agreeing with Spencer and people like Spencer, and basically devising intelligence tests to screen out the most unintelligent people who were considered to be at the bottom of this food chain, and where basically there was advocation from the government, from churches, from business leaders, etc., to let these people just kind of die off, so we could lower our population numbers and then have a stronger, more adapting and adaptable human race. So some interesting and troubling ideas that were going on there. Now, we're going to segue into Germany. We're going to go to a couple of guys, Gall and Spurzheim. Now, I'm going to go back for a second. They were phrenologists. Now, loosely defined, phrenology is, quote, science of the mind, end quote. It's not really a science, and you're going to see how and why phrenology isn't really scientific. But here's what these guys did. Again, they were working in Germany. I didn't put the years for them up there. We're talking like the 1700s here. This is where we're at in history. They came up with this map of the brain, or of the skull. That would be a better way to say it. You may not be able to make this out, and that's okay. But basically, as you can tell, they would kind of map out different parts of the brain, and they would number them. And the idea was they would sit you in a chair, they would basically feel around on your skull. Now, largely these were rich, aristocratic women who were coming in and paying for this service. So there's a lot of speculation that these guys were just kind of like, creepers a little bit, feeling around on the heads of women. Well, we don't know that for sure. But what we do know is that what they were doing was not accurate. Now, here's what they would do. They have this map of the brain. They feel around on your head, and you can do it to yourself right now. Feel around on your scalp. In some places, you're going to feel like bumps, like raised spots, like maybe like a bump. Now, and I have one. I can find several. If you have something that's raised or a bump, you find out where that area is on the map, on the brain map, and that means you have an abundance of whatever that is. So, if I have a bump right here where it says number 11, which reads caution or cautiousness, that would mean that I'm overly cautious. Feeling around, let's say that number 3, I have a bump right there, love of friends. That would mean that I have an abundance of love for my friends. Now, conversely, you feel around on your head, you'll feel that you have some grooves or indentations. That would imply a lack of something. That means you don't have enough of something. So let's just say I'm feeling around. I can feel I've got a groove or a little indentation right here where it says hope, which is number 16. That would imply that I do not have a whole lot of hope, or that I'm lacking hope. Or spirituality, which would be number 17. Maybe I'm not spiritual enough. And they would basically come up with this personality printout, if you will, based on the bumps and the grooves in your head. Now, it doesn't work like this, by the way. They were exposed as being frauds. Some people even went as far as to say they were kind of creepy because they were feeling around on these girls' heads and charging for it. Here's the important thing. They did come across something incredibly important. Localization of function. They did discover, by accident maybe, that certain, and write this down, certain parts of the brain control certain parts of our functioning. Now, if you go back to this map does not explain specifically how that works, okay? Because these areas don't correlate to anything. However, what we understand today is that there are certain parts of the brain that do control certain parts of our functioning, just not the way that Gall and Spurzheim kind of played it out for us. So that's very, very important. And probably the most famous case study in all of psychology is the story of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a Vermont railroad worker, and he was working in the late 1800s. Your book has this story, I'm certain of it. I'll tell it briefly here. Definitely the most famous case study in all of psychology. He survived an explosion where a steel rod went through his head. Oops, I went to the wrong. Let me go back for a second. Now, the interesting thing about this, you would imagine an explosion, a steel rod looking like this, going through the lower part left eye, so you can see it, and exiting out the top right part of his brain. That would kill someone, especially in the 1800s when medical technology wasn't great. But it did not kill him. He lived, amazingly. Certainly he had some problems. It severed his optic nerve, so he was blind in that eye. Also, it changed his personality. We talked in class about how head injuries can change personality, and that happened here, among other things. He was very easygoing, easy to get along with, laid back, chill kind of guy. After the injury, he became very, very angry. He was easily irritated, cranky, and I guess I would be too if I, had a giant gaping hole in my skull. But it changed his personality, and it changed the way he functioned on a lot of different levels. And this started the idea of us thinking again, or continued the idea of us thinking, wait a minute, certain parts of the brain maybe do really control certain things. So we're back to the idea, again, localization of function. Just reinforcing the idea that certain parts of the brain really do in fact control certain parts of our functioning. So that was his major contribution. And he also did travel in a circus for a while to try to make money, because he certainly couldn't work the way he did before the accident. And then the last slide, nothing to do with this lecture, but a random cute pet picture. That's pretty much it for the second part of the history lecture. That's it for the history stuff, actually. We're going to be moving next into some other things. So, again, make sure you have good notes on this stuff. And that's the end of this part. Thank you.